as you can imagine, I really love the Reno Air Race motif or style for designing a model. I've done it so many times that I feel like I have my own little Reno Air Race here if I could only figure out how to fly them all at once. Anyway. So anyway, this morning we woke up to yet another day. This is the third day in a row that it's been snowing. Not heavily, but it just takes a chunk of the fun out of the day, knowing you have to spend time shoveling. In my case, I have 3 houses that I have to shovel. And when I get up in the morning like this, I just think as soon as I get back, I'm going to start working on the model, and it just makes all the pain go away. Now let's get down to the shop here. We're done for the day with the snow. I have said this a million times, but I'll say it again. This is the part of the model. We are coming up on the part of the model where it's all in one piece, and then we start doing this many hours of final detail finishing. And that's one of the parts of modeling that I really enjoy a lot. It seems to me like all the hours that I spend doing finishing, and I really do spend quite a few, those are the hours that they're relaxing to me, they're enjoyable. Out of the corner of my eye I can be watching Speed Vision or some videos or something. But it's relaxing time. It's not like the time that I normally do things. It's a production race. The finishing part of it is very relaxing to me. Now I want to start, before we even go down and start working on a model and get our hands dirty and start thinking up the house, I want to make a little dissertation about silk span, because I think this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of modeling. And I want to start by saying, if you see this model and you've watched any of it be built on video, this was an I-beam, even though it had a carbon fiber I-beam. One of the things, right up until the point that I covered the wing, it was really flimsy, and you could grab the tip and twist it around and beat it like a bad stepchild. Once you put the silk span and a couple of coats of dope on it, it locked up like a drum, and believe me, you can't move that wing even a 64th of an inch right now. Now let me do a little storyboard on this. This is critical information. This is something I think most modelers don't really understand fully. Something that may help you enjoy if you're designing your own plane or doing your first really nice finish. This is good information. Now, here's one of the things you have to realize. Silk span has been around since forever. There's a reason it's been around forever, is it suits our needs. And when I say that, here's what I find constantly happens, and it's kind of the question. As soon as I hear this question, I know I'm in for a long afternoon with a relatively new guy. You get somebody, they want to replace silk span. They came out with this great new material XXXXX, and you don't need it. You don't need to dope it. You just put it on the model. You can drop screwdrivers on it, and forgot to tell you, it's very heavy. Well, so the first thing you can really put in the bank with silk span is one little thing you can put right away. It's light. The good qualities of silk span, it's light. It's the lightest covering there is. Now, for some people, the first question, and now we'll go right back into the question and answer, like we would do at a stunt clinic. But Wendy, monocoat is light and you don't have to paint it. Yes, true. But you need to combine this with the word strongest. Now you may think, well, how strong does it have to be? Well, the stronger the better. The strength of the tissue, no matter what kind of wing you have the various ways that a wing bends. It bends in span loading mode. The tips want to go up and down. It also torques. It twists. The lift is being made on the back end of the wing primarily, and it wants to twist the wing up. Strongest is a critical part of this. Now, you can find all these coverings, and I've tried samples of every one I think they make, and I've never found anything even close to being as light and as strong as Silkspan. Now, the reason it's light and strong is it's made to works with dope. And I'll give a little analogy here. The same way fiberglass or carbon fiber cloth is made to work with resin. It's a system where they work together, and the sum total of the two combined is better than each individual product. What happens, especially with Brodak's dope, it's a proprietary formula, and let's repeat again for the people that still think you can just run down the airport and buy a gallon of Randolph dope. You run the risk that you're not going to get, you're either going to get dope that shrinks way more than you need to, or dope that doesn't shrink at all. And in either case, it's not good. The ratio, the shrink ratio of Brodak dope is what makes it so good. Now, what happens is the shrink rate of the dope and the strength of the Silkspan, these three things combine into being, for lack of a better word, a drum. Picture a drum where you tighten the screws around, it gets tighter and tighter. And it gives tremendous strength. And now, if I say something right now, most people are going to disagree. Silkspan, ounce for ounce, is stronger than carbon fiber. In fact, it's stronger than almost every material on the airplane. If I put the Silkspan that covers an I-beam wing, I've added only 2, 3, maybe 5 grams to that panel, but I've tripled the strength, doubled it, quadrupled it. Gram for gram, the Silkspan is the strongest part of the model. Now, luckily for us, it suits another need. You can make a beautiful finish on it. When you use some of these other materials, you can see the weave coming through on some of them. Some of them, the paint doesn't stick the way it should, and you run all kinds of maybes. What I call is anytime you add a new material to the finishing matrix, you have this. Everybody knows what Russian roulette is. Well, here's what I'm going to do today. I just came up with this new finishing material, blankety blank. Who needs Brodak dope? We'll just use dope right from the airport. Who needs the thinner that comes with Brodak dope? We'll invent our own thinner. Let's use acetone. Each time you add one of these new products, what happens? It's another bullet in the gun, and you're the one pulling the trigger. Every single time. So to minimize this, my suggestion, if you haven't seen the Brodak dope videos, those cover 99% of what you need to know. The parts that you don't need to know, the formulas that go into the shrink rate, the Silkspan, now don't forget Silkspan comes light, medium, and heavy. If you try to use heavy, the finish just gets unnecessarily heavy. If you try to use light, what happens? Over open bays, it's very delicate, and you really don't get enough material in the finish that it does what Silkspan is supposed to do. And let me just make a little cutaway view of this, and this will all make sense. Okay, now picture this. Here's your wood. You've got several coats of dope in here, and then the tissue. Now within this layer has to be a certain thickness. Number one, because it's got to span the wood grain. Even though the wood grain may or may not get filled with dope totally, or spackle, this spans it just like it spans an open bay, so it tends to make it a lot nicer. It gives you a flatter finish. People will often want to know, why do you have to Silkspan the body? Well, because you want to have this, the matrix, the combination of Silkspan and dope becomes part of your finish, and it adds tremendous strength. Now, when you're making a carbon fiber part, the idea is to get as much carbon and as little resin into the matrix. It's the same with Silkspan. You'd like to get as much Silkspan on the model and as little dope to make that substrate over the wood. Once that substrate is there and it's nice and flat, you've got every chance in the world of block sanding it out, not changing in time. A lot of good things happen. Now, we did this test years ago. Jim Damerel brought over 2 flaps for a pattern master, and he had some of this black, the carbon weave, which Les seems to love. I'm not a big fan of it. We covered 1 flap. We did a totally normal finish, did the same on both, and one we did the silk span on. Sanded them down. He took them home, did all the sanding, prepped them, got them up to silver. The silk span one was noticeably stronger by an amount you could feel. You didn't even have to measure it. The one with the carbon matte was weaker and heavier. And there's a reason why. There's a reason a lot of people don't understand. And I just want to, if I can put this idea out to you and you can become a believer in it, what you'll find out is it'll help in a lot of ways to make the model stronger, lighter, and more beautiful all at the same time. But you've got to understand what silk span really does to a model. Go back to that proprietary shrink ratio. What happens is, in all cases, let's say you have an open wing, and let's just say for the sake of argument you have these possibilities. You have like a nobler wing, traditional type of wing. You also have an I-beam wing like an Aries, and you've got all the ribs out there, the half ribs. You've also got a foam wing, and it won't matter what the wing is made out of. It won't matter if it's carbon fiber. So this is the point. Or if you have a Miss Ashley carbon wing. It won't matter what kind of wing you have. Here's what happens. When dope and tissue go on, tissue goes on, you wet it, when you wet it, it expands. It goes on to the model. As the dope shrinks and as the tissue, the water or the Windex evaporates, it shrinks down. What that means is it's always under tension like a rubber band. There's always some tension in it. And it's that tension that makes strength. Now when you put carbon on, carbon doesn't shrink. Take some carbon, put some water in it. A lot of people have been able to make nice surface finishes, and because it's carbon, they're overwhelmed by the word carbon, and they think, oh, I've just added a gazillion tons of strength. You haven't. You haven't added as much as tissue. Medium silk span with the shrink rate is like putting 1,000 rubber bands around the model in every way. And it's the tension that you build up that builds the strength. And it doesn't matter, even on a Miss Ashley wing, that material is always in tension. On a D-tube wing, Spitfire wing, I-beam wing, foam wing, the material is always in tension, and that's what gives you the strength. So when I'm going to go today, I'm going to take all the parts of the model that I can that have not been tissued, including the carbon parts, and put single and double layers of tissue over them selectively. It's going to build strength. Even on the carbon fiber fuselage, it's going to add strength. And it's going to give me a great base to lay that finish down. Now last night what I did, I took some of that filler material, looked for little defects in all carbon parts, filled in on all of them, but this is a strong surface. This can't you can't do this with a regular model. You'll put fingernail marks in it. But once this is tissued, even better. The tissue really adds a great substrate to the carbon, and it also adds, and I know this for a fact because I've done this to the Typhoon and to the Miss Ashley fuselage. When I'm done tissuing it, it's a lot stronger. I can feel in the torsional rigidity of it that it's stronger. There's a lot of things you don't have to measure. You can just feel them. Little parts like this is about 5 coats of clear on it. I'm just going to lightly sand this the one final time. This will be ready to tissue, and this will be real important because this is there's tension between these two screws that really adds a lot of strength to the back of the plane. And I want to have this to be a good skin, and I want the skin not only to have that nice finish, but to be adding some strength, not just going along like a Christmas tree ornament. Now, the last couple of years I've been trying a little method that I use. I'm not sure it's so tricky or new. What happens when I'm carving, hollowing, or whatever, I wind up sometimes, and I have a piece on the nacelle where the skin is very thin. Now, I've been trying to fix this, but what happens as you sand it, it just goes down and you never really can get that fixed. I have a couple spots on the nacelles that I've never really been happy with. No matter how many times I sand them, they still have that little distortion to them because I've hollowed or sanded the part too thin. Now, when you make a part that's too thin, it doesn't matter if it's a cowling, a top block, a rudder, or whatever. There's a really neat little trick. Silk span over it, and then silk span, like I call it, a little wedding cake. 2 or 3, maybe even 4 pieces, each one just a little bit smaller. Let it dry. Give it a couple days to dry. Now what happens is you have, this part is now solid, and you can sand on it. And now you can block sand over it, and it'll hold the shape a lot better, and then you can put a little more of that red filler or a couple more coats of whatever. But putting multiple layers of silk span in selected spots. Now what I'm going to try to do on the fuselage side, just to make this simple, all along the side where I have no formers in the back because of the push rod trough, and up in the front, in fact I'm probably going to just double tissue the whole side of the A26 fuselage where the formers come, and maybe that'll just add just a little bit of strength. Where the 2 joints come together, right at that joint is probably a spot where I can put a little band-aid of double tissue. Any place you have a joint is a good place, and you can do it selectively. You can do it as you go along. And what's the worst thing can happen if you don't like the result? In a matter of 30 seconds you can sand it off. But with the silk span, you're using it as a matrix. It's combining with the dope and making a material that gives you what I call the best of all worlds. It's strong. It's the strongest way you can cover a model. It's the lightest. I think it's the most beautiful if my vote counts. And as a side benefit, it's a craftsman thing. It gives you a skill or a craft that once you learn it, you can go on and do a lot of other things with that technology. You could refinish furniture. I've refinished a lot of things around the house. But the most enjoyment I get is a relaxing day like today. It's snowing outside. I'm locked in the house, and I'm going to be using silk span basically the whole day. Good information. I hope it can. Now what I did, I purposely left this area so you could see. This is where I double and triple silk spanned it. This was an area, and what had happened is I had stuck a fingernail in here, made a little dent, and no matter how I sanded it, I never could get it. It would always, when the dope dried, it would have a little ripple in it. Well, what that's usually telling you is it's too thin. When you know it's too thin, adding some of these layers, and the nice thing about doing what we'll call this body work, for lack of a better word, you can do body work right up into the minute you paint the last coat of silver. So in this case, I'm going to sand this down wet. Before I start today's work with the silk span, I'm going to try to get the silver on this so this can be drying. I can put this out in the garage and this can be drying. I like to do this first thing in the morning, anything I have to spray, because that's what it allows to do. The dope gas is off outside for a couple hours, then I could bring it back in the house. Now another little issue, if this isn't thick enough, I can put the next layer of tissue. In other words, once I change the shape and build up the shape, I can build that tissue out to the edge. And this gets into the area of how fussy do you really want to be, because let's face the fact, you can be infinitely fussy and the model will never get built, something I've fallen in a trap of, and not realizing that, I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing it. The thing you never want to do with this red filler material is get it anywhere near a fillet. And if you're getting down to where you're almost near raw wood where we are right now, I'm going to hit this with just a little bit of white primer, a little Brodak primer, just so I can feather it in a little easier. And we'll see if that has the shape that I'm looking for. I can usually feel if it's feeling like what I want it to feel like. And that's close. Now, on an area this big, when it's patched, always a good idea to just hit it with just a little bit of white primer. The trick to doing any kind of body work, I'll call this body work, is the feather edging. You've got to get that edge where it just feathers out. They call it feather edging. And until it feather edges, you'll have a problem. Now, I think the next step on this is going to be, I'm just going to simply from this point back put some white primer on that. Now, this can dry, and by the same time I'm doing that, I'll put a little coat of primer up in there. This has 5 coats of dope on it now. I can sand that. It's ready. Any of these little spots that I'm working on, a little bit of white primer goes a long way toward making it blend in, and just enough. Just cover it. Don't put it on like you're painting a house. And when that white primer dries, and I can do that, and that'll be dry in an hour or so. In the meantime, I can be doing some silk spanning. Now I hit all these areas with the white Rodak primer. It's no fun painting out in my garage right now. But it's going to sit up by the heating vent. The heat is on. This should dry up in, well, by the time we get the other part silk spanned, this will be ready. Ready to wet sand that out with 1200 and put on another coat of silver. And it's just an endless job putting in the silver and taking it off, but I think the results, when this is done, the results are really going to be well worth it. And every time I look over at the B25, I think, sure, hey, while I was putting in all those hours, some long days, some long nights, but now, just a lot of fun having it in the shop. It's a real pleasure having this guy for a companion during the day. Now, it's always a good idea when I'm going to do any silk spin is start on the smallest parts first. This is a little spot we needed to touch up. Just need to grind away the extra, the red lead. Always have the tissue cut, oversized, and just sitting there ready to go. I like Windex because it doesn't penetrate the wood. On carbon, it doesn't matter. I'm just in a habit of doing it. I don't want it soaked. I just want it damp. That's why it's nice to use a towel. In this case, if there's any extra in there, it'll just absorb into the towel. Again, we're trying to build that, whatever you want to call it, that rubber band effect, that stretch effect that gives us really a lot of strength. Now, if we're doing a wood part or a carbon part, it doesn't matter. We want to build a bond between these two, the tissue and this part. And I don't want to fool around trying to put a little tiny amount of dope on there, because whatever extra goes on there is going to come right up through the material. Again, it's always a good idea to do all your small parts first. Just gets you kind of in the mood, because if that's the right word. Get a really good coat on there. One of the places you can really go wrong is trying to skimp on dope at this point. And my technique is to just press it right down, keep it good and wet. You can try to get as many of the wrinkles out as you can, but again, not critical. The wrinkles sand right out. But the trick is, get it good and wet. No matter what material you're going over, the silk span has to be saturated to get a good bond. Now, a lot of people like to do this. They like to just keep brushing it down, pressing it down. I've seen a lot of different ways to do it. One of the ways I like is just press it down either with your bare hands or with gloves. But the more you can press it down, the better of a chance there's going to be that you get a good bond. And when you start pulling the masking tape up, you'll be glad you have that bond. Now what happens, it starts to dry as you do this. You can feel it turning like the fly paper. Just wet it down a little bit more. And then we'll put it aside to dry. Since we have the heating vent on, we may get several coats on today. It's okay to get it by a heating vent as long as you're not creating little bubbles in the paint. If there are, then you know you're too close, move the part further away. And it's not a good idea to use a hair dryer or something that really gets the part hot. Now, the next step on this is going to be just let it dry, and then we'll trim the edge. Let it dry just a little bit. I'm also going to just tissue these edges up. What it'll do, even though it's not an appearance thing here, it'll make this wood a lot stronger and give me some material in that joint to sand. This will sand very easily when I want to do those final fits in the joints. This will just tighten them up just a little bit. Again, the trick here is let it dry and then trim it. Don't try to trim it all at one time. And what happens with me when I'm starting to work on a part like this, I get comfortable about an hour into the job where I'm what I call slinging putty. It just goes on nice. In the beginning, my fingers get a little distorted, rubbery, or whatever. Silkspan is an amazing, amazing product. And we have, when a product stands the test of time for how many years, 50 years or whatever, you know it's got to be doing something right. That for all those years I haven't anyway, come up with anything better. It's really still state of the art. It's still a material that wins the Concourse Award and gives you planes that last 20, 25 years, even longer. Maybe longer if we only knew we were going to live that long. Okay, now this can get put aside to dry, get trimmed later, or work on the next part. Now I've sanded this many times already in between coats, but I still want to pick up any high spots here. Especially on wood parts, because what happens with wood parts, as you dope them the first couple times, they tend to find their own equilibrium or whatever. And this little part took us so long to make. That's one of the things when you make a take-apart plane. One of the first things is the things you think are going to take a lot of time really don't take a lot more time than lining up the plane the regular way. But then there's little parts like this that just make you crazy. And then you think, well, boy, this didn't pay. But then you get to the point where we are now, where we're starting to put the finish on, and you go, oh my God, how could anybody build a plane in one piece? It just gets so difficult. It's really an eye-opener when you see how easy it is to paint and finish a plane that's in parts. Now, on a day like today, one of the things I try to keep in mind is that I always get something drying, and there's always something for me to work on. Now that's another gain as opposed to painting a whole plane at once. There's days you're painting a plane in one piece and you put a coat of filler on and you're done for the day. You can't really work, or a coat of clear or something. With this, we're always working on something. We always have some part that needs another coat of silver, some part that needs a little sand out, some part that needs a touch-up, and we can pick away at it. While it's in pieces like this, we can pick away at it endlessly. I'm not sure that would be possible when a plane was in one piece. I remember the last plane I did, the Spitfire, the 96 Spitfire. And I kept thinking, wow, is this difficult? There's got to be a better way. And for me and my shop conditions, the take-apart system that I guess is pretty universal now, just proved to work very well for me. Here's what helps. As a part is drying up by the heating vent, look what I got. I got a little helper here. Hey! He's knocked these things on a floor. Look, now he just fell off the TV. That's what makes the parts dry quicker, is having the bird pick away at them. Yeah, that's right. I'm talking to you. There's nobody else here. Get away from those parts. Nice. Tissuing goes quickly. And as you do a couple of the little parts, you get into a little bit of a rhythm, I guess. Rhythm's the right word. And while one part is drying, assuming the bird doesn't knock it on the floor, or he doesn't knock the wood parts on the floor, the important part is not to worry about the seams, but just get one coat minimum of tissue on everything. And any place where you have two coats, two layers, it'll sand right down anyway. It won't even matter. And if you sand through down a bare wood, put a little patch in, a little postage stamp. One place we don't ever want to get tissue is in a fillet. See that piece? We got to pull that up where that fillet is. And anytime you can tear a little edge instead of cutting it, just tear it. That leaves a nice an area that's easy to feather in. Now in this case, I want to trim this piece because I want to put the second piece in there. Normally I just wait till it dries a little bit and it feathers right off. When we finish this piece, we'll be ready to do the fuselage. I'll be in my whatever it is, that I'm comfortable working with the material again. Nothing in the fillets, ever. Don't get near the fillets. Leave an eighth of an inch away from a fillet. You just play it safe that way. This piece too, I'll do the bulkhead areas. It'll just give me some soft material to tighten up those joints when I block sand them in. And we can just estimate where this one piece ended. Let it overlap a quarter of an inch or so, not a problem. Now on a fuselage, I'm going to want to put several places where there's double and triple tissue, so we'll be pretty selective about it that way. And of course you can do that no matter what model you're building. Nothing changes because it's a Bomber or a Cavalier or a Brodak Cardinal or whatever, Noble or anything. Okay, so we're sneaking up on having this part done. The only thing left is going to be that fuselage. And of course, while this is drying, we'll be working on a fuselage. As soon as we're done with the fuselage, the other two little parts, this part and the bottom, the belly pan, should be ready for their next coat. So see, we're constantly having one drying and one we can sand, dope, tissue, whatever, work on. We're never sitting here with nothing to do. And what happens, you're not impatient this way, because no matter what you do, there'll always be something to sand, something to put silver on, something to silver finish. We don't have a piece of tissue big enough here. I remember one of the fellows in the club, without mentioning any names, brought over a little Brodak Cardinal with some kind of covering material that was supposed to be that you could drop screwdrivers on it and stuff. And yeah, you could. The only problem, it was really, really heavy, and we pulled that material off, and just the wing, what was on the wing was probably 7 or 8 ounces of material, and it took a lot of paint to fill in the grain. Silk span is definitely worth, even if you have to learn the skills. If you don't have the skills early, and you've got to do a couple practice planes to get it right, it's worth getting right. We'll prep this up. Just try to get a little sanding on any of the little dings. Cut the silk span up ahead of time. We'll see how we're going to lay this out. It won't matter where the joints go or how many joints we have. They'll all sand right out. It will be inconsequential. Now I got a big piece of the tissue dampened up, and it's really not important to try to do this in a few pieces, but if we can, it's just a challenge anyway. We'll go plenty far around the outside. Hey, who are you singing to? Chicky, I'm the only one here. Chicky! Okay, so we can go about back to here. Again, when you do a piece this big, the problem is you got to kind of work fast, but hey, you're never away, and there's nothing you can ever do with this. That's a problem that you can't sand off. Listen to him. Quiet! And we just heard the weather report. Karen gave me a call to let me know that tomorrow is supposed to be 6 more inches of snow. That I should plan on working on my model. What a disappointment. Chicky, who are you talking to? Now it's always nice, believe me, if you have a helper here, but I like to gauge everything around the idea that I have to work alone, whatever that's worth. And days like today when I am working alone. Chicky, is that the only song you know? thinks he's a songbird. Baltimore Orioles are songbirds. Chicky, you're supposed to be singing that to your girlfriend, not to me. He thinks I'm his girlfriend. Chicky, forget it. Forget it, I'll have you locked up. And it really is nice to know that you can do these jobs without a helper, but it sure is nice if you have a helper, that's for sure. And remember, what we're trying to do is get the whole thing tissued. We don't have to worry too much about the joints, but everything I want covered with tissue. And in the selected spots where I'm going to want 2 or 3 layers. Chicky, I'm calling the cops. That's all there is to it. And one thing good about medium silk span, it's real easy to work with. It just doesn't get any easier than medium silk span. Another thing with carbon, you don't have to worry about it ever warping. Nothing's going to get wet and warped, so you really can have that for an advantage. Okay, now it would seem like what we want to do up by the windshield here. We can just randomly trim that off. See how much of this we can get to go around, maybe a little bit. I really don't have to or want to go past the middle by more than 1/4 of an inch. Reason is I'll have the seam go right down the middle. Cut this right about here. All the joy that love can bring, I will be remembering the shadow of your smile. And we know the other side will come around that far. The front here we can pretty much just use a separate piece up here. Now, where you have a wrinkle like this, the one choice I have, I can pull this wrinkle out as much as possible, but I don't have to worry about getting it totally out because that will sand right out. Keep the part wet and just keep everything pressed down. If you really want to be cute, what you can do is slit some of these wrinkles. Just for laughs, we'll do that. Not critical. Slit the wrinkle, run a razor blade through it. You want to be careful on a wood part that you're not going through into the wood. I can pick this up, get rid of that. Yeah, it just makes a little less sanding. Again, none of this is critical. As long as we have tissue on everything, I'll feel like we have accomplished our goal. Tissue up here. And there's no substitute for just rubbing it down with your hands, bare hands here. Your best tool. And we don't want any up in the fillet area here. I want to make sure I don't have any going up there. Let's see about the canopy area. We'll try to work it up to halfway. The one you've been waiting for, the big blossoms of white will burst into sight, and your love. Because now we have a complex curve here. Off by the canopy, we're going to have to slit this.
If it takes forever, I will wait for you.
We may have to keep this out of the fillet area, so we're going to have to trim back on this.
I will wait for you. Till your blood beside me, till I'm holding you.
I thought maybe I could pull this around, get some of the wrinkles out. Really trying to work my way up to within 1/4 of an inch of the middle of the fuselage. Slit some of the wrinkles.
Every day, remember how I love you.
I'm going to razor down it.
In your heart, believe what in my heart.
Now in this case, I just pulled a little piece out of there. It's not a problem. We'll just put a little patch in there. It looks like we can get this right up to about the middle.
I
think if you see half of this, you can pretty much figure out what the rest of it's like. Not a big deal. We can slit this. Again, we don't have to have a fancy joint here.
Forever, I will wait for you for hours under summer. I will wait for you till you're here beside me.
The point is, no matter how sloppy you are, you can always sand it out. And I guess more or less just for exercise, I try to get as many of the wrinkles out as I can, but it's certainly not necessary. Now back here, we can try to get some of these out. I don't think this will be a big problem. Get most of them out.
The hanging day in Wood City, Wyoming, Wood City, Wyoming, 1894. It's on a dock at the loom, through the gallows door. She has the smile of an angel, the eyes of an angel, the face.
Now, once this dries, I'll slit the bottom off, flip it and do the other side. May as well do the other side off camera. That's basically how we're going to do it. And everything's going to be covered with one layer, at least one layer, and some places two, of that silk span. Now today, with 3 coats of dope on this that's dried overnight up by the heating vent, I'm going to just get a little look at how this is going to sand out. As soon as you see powder, you know it's fine, it's ready to sand. So today what I'll try to do is basically do the same thing that I'm doing to this, block sand it out, get all the high edges out. See how quickly that sands down, because the tissue really is acting like filler here. It's creating a matrix. Believe it or not, that's relatively smooth. Another couple of coats of clear will take maybe 2 more coats brushed on. And I'm going to sand it between each coat now. Once the part is sanded down, this will probably be the 4th coat. I'd really like to get at least 5 coats on before I really start looking to detail a part out, but It never hurts to sand it one extra time, that's for sure. And if you really want to be fanatical, you can sand it between coats, or you might run the risk of taking some of the tissue off too. You don't want to go back down to having no tissue on here. A good compromise is about 5 coats. And then we should start to see a good base to put some filler coat on. Oh, I'm even trying to keep these edges radiused. Every time I do a sand out, I radius the edges. Now all the wood we need to fuel proof, but the carbon we don't. So no paint at all needs to go on a carbon. And that's a nice little advantage of doing this. But I really like to get good thick coats on, not clay coats. And as predicted, it's snowing today, so you just can't win. We thought we were going to have an early spring. What we're having is a late winter. Now I'm basically going to do the same thing to all the other parts, and basically redundant here, do them off camera, until I build up a good solid 5 coats or so sanded out, and sanded at least 2 or 3 times in between with 320, and get a nice base on here for the filler coat. And anytime I can, because it's cold, the heat is on, and we have the fuselage up here, we're coming up on having 2 more coats, and we'll be ready to start looking at some filler coat for these parts. I just took these parts down. They've been drying overnight, sanded them with some 400. This part is actually ready for a coat of silver talc. And I'm wondering, maybe one more coat of clear on this. This will be ready for a coat of talc too. So we're sneaking up on that finish. It takes really about 5 brushed on coats to get that base that I like before I start the silver. But I think our parts are ready. We'll do a little test on these parts and see what they look like in silver. And if they look like they're going to be okay, then we'll shoot the fuselage too. The sooner we can get the first coat of silver on and start to see the errors, the quicker, we just get through the finish part of it. We need to get up into the silver where we can start to see the mistakes. This guy's been hanging up by the heating vent. We've been working on that bottom piece. Primer. Little spots around the fillets that I wanted to address. Actually, they're all ready for silver today. We just went through 3 days of snow, and there's still plenty of snow out here, but let's see if I can get some silver on that, just to test to see how those parts are coming out. More of a test than anything else. Talc with a little bit of silver with a little bit of talc in it. A little spot out at the end of it. Okay, now because this has talc in it, once this dries, we'll be able to sand this right down. And I think we'll be ready for a real coat of, when I say a real coat of silver, a silver that has no talc in it. This will dry right up. You can see it's kind of orange peely. It's made to be filler. You never really know when it's time for the silver until you see a little bit of a shine, just a tad of a shine. Now, if I see these parts are dry, I'll wait a half an hour, 45 minutes or so, and then just put on a coat of clear. Spray on a coat of clear. Oh, I think we're in good shape. Again, the talc doesn't dry as shiny as normal silver. This is going to take a little time to dry. I think we're in good shape. We've got this finish based out, and now we can start, once these dry, sanding our coats of silver. Always the most fun. Shoveling snow and sanding silver. Here's our first coat of silver filler on here. Now, even though you could sand this out the next day, or sometimes you can shoot it in the morning and sand it in the afternoon, as long as you wet sand it, I always find that if I let it dry an extra day, it just makes so much more sense than to try to rush it through. These parts absolutely look like one or two sand outs, and we'll have it. You can still see the really rough graininess, but we're sneaking up on having that finish. Now, the reason I wanted to get all these parts, at least the first coat of silver, a second coat of silver, is because while they're drying and while they're hardening up, I have plenty of other shop projects to work on. And now they can just sit there drying away under the heating vent while I work on other stuff. Hey, we wake up to more snow, but if we have more snow today, it'll give us a good chance to sand out all that silver. I'm really looking forward to starting to see how these parts, the finish is going to shape up. I'm glad I got some of that material on yesterday. Because again, look how much snow snowed. Just snowing away out there. The longer it sits up by the heating vent, the better. And the longer the heat is on, the better. So that should be ready to sand right now. Now our stuff has dried up, and I'm going to try to get this on the macro lens, but I don't know if I can. We just focus this in. Now this is the bottom pan, and we can start with the smallest parts first. I try to look at how this silver talc has filled in. Now because it's got talc in it, you can see it's dried kind of sandpapery. It's probably covered most of the floors. There's one right there, but that's not a floor, that's a hole. That's a hole where we put the Allen wrench. I'm looking at it from a lot of different angles. Now the reason is, here's a good example of how deep the pits are. See, we need to fill those pits, which means we're probably going to have to sand at least one or two more times. But that's perfectly okay. But what I want to mention is the way I pick which grade of sandpaper to use. I try to look at this. And for this piece, I'm going to guess 600 sandpaper is going to be fine. But if this were a little bit rougher, well, we could use 400 or 500. And the best way to do it, there's no substitute for just doing a test. Now, I'll show you what happens. Maybe make a little storyboard out of this, it'll be easier. If you have a part, the part is rough, okay, especially wood, and you sand it with 600 paper, well, it gets better, but it doesn't change the shape of the material. There's two distinct things happen. You change the shape to where that sandpaper is rough enough that it cuts right in and changes the shape. The other one is once you have the shape you want is putting the finish. The finish means it's just taking very little amounts off each time, and it leaves a very smooth finish. Now that's hard to believe, but using the right sandpaper can cut the job basically in a fraction of the amount of time. In other words, if you started off and the only sandpaper you had to build a model was 600, you'd be there forever. If you had only, let's say, 320, you'd never get a nice finish. It's the sandpaper you use, say, let's just say 320, 400, 500, these are the ones I typically use, and 1200. Now, even up to anything up to about 320 is going to change the shape of the material. And this is important to understand when you want to do this finishing and get it not only as nice as possible, but as quick as possible. You don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours doing something you don't have to do. Now, the sandpapers between 4, 5, and 6 are to put a finish. They impart a nice smooth finish. But they leave scratches. So before you put the last coat of silver on, the last coat you should use 1200 because that leaves no scratches. The reason you use 1200, if you use 1500 or 2000, it just takes a whole lot longer and it doesn't get any better. And if you use 1000, I've still seen some little microscopic scratches with 1000. So I've come up with this system for myself in my shop conditions and my way of finishing that's been real helpful. Anything up to 320. When I use 320, let me get a little piece of paper and show this. Here we have a piece of 320. This is 320. And you can do this little test yourself somewhere on the model where it's going to be an inconspicuous spot. Oh hell, you can use 320. You can use it dry. Let's just sand a little spot and see what happens. Now the only problem if I do the whole thing like this, it's going to get smoother, but see the scratches, it's really not going to give me the smoothness that I need. So if I go to 400, let me just do a little piece here. You really should do this wet once you have this much material on a model. What happens? You're not changing the shape as much, but you're putting in, if you were to rub your hand on this, you can almost hear it. Let me be real quiet. You even can hear the difference. This is much smoother. Well, obviously, if we go to 1200, let's get a little piece of 1200 out here. What's going to happen, it takes, and I'm doing it dry so you can see the sanding scratches. From this point on, we'll be wet sanding. But what will happen, and this is a good little lesson, is do this little test yourself somewhere on the model, just to feel the difference. Now, that's like, really like glass. But see, we've taken down all the high spots and you can see all the valleys. We've done the same thing here, but we've left scratches everywhere. Now the problem with the scratches, when you put the next coat of material on, if the scratches go down deep enough, and they will on a part like the fuselage, because we're going to have to really grind away, what happens, some of that thinner gets in there and softens everything up, and it can tend to be a problem if you have too many deep scratches. So if you're wrong, it's always better to be a little bit lighter on the grade. In other words, if you're wrong, it's better to use 400 instead of 320, 600 instead of 400, or when you're shooting for that last coat, when you think, gee, I only need one more coat of silver to finalize this, then I would say 1200 is appropriate. And even if you have to do it 1200 2 or 3 times, well, it's going to be labor intensive, but what's going to happen, the result is going to be just smooth as silk when you're done. So, with that little idea in mind, let's see what these parts dried up like. It won't take long to figure out what our next step is here. What I'm going to try to do with these parts, I'm going to cut up a piece of 600 paper, and this is what I would suggest as being a good way of making the most efficient use of your sandpaper. Cut it up into various little squares. Most of it we can do with a block. Even if you do the whole thing with a block, the last thing, just before you're done, you want to do some by hand. You want to do it with the soft part of your hand. So if we have these pieces already cut up, that gets us started. Remember the old trick, good ventilation. I try to do as much as I can with the block, but then finish it up by hand, by the soft part of your hand. I always keep a fan running while I'm doing this. The fumes are not good to be breathing over and over and over again, that's for sure. But you want to determine at this point in time, this is certainly not the last coat of silver, but as soon as I think there's any chance at all it'll be the last coat of silver, I'll switch over to 1200 paper. Now this gives me a couple of tip-offs. I can see the high spots right away. This is where we're going to be needing more material. So I'm going to be real careful about doing this. I'm going to go over the whole part. In fact, I'll sand everything down since it's a snowy day and we can't paint today. I'll get everything sanded down as best I can. I don't want to go any deeper. I don't want to go grinding through to where I'm through and coming out the other end of the tissue if possible. And if I do, if I hit a high spot, I can just put a little tissue patch there, brush on some clear, a couple of coats of filler later, it'll just go away. To show you as I'm working this part here, when you can still see these little shiny spots, these are little moon craters, you know you have more sanding to do. Over here, you know that's about all you can remove. You don't want to go down to where there's no filler. The idea is to know just how much filler to leave. If you sand it all off, probably didn't do too much, didn't hurt anything, but you didn't do too much. You want to leave just that right amount that in the low spots, especially in the tissue, in the low spots, that's where the filler is staying, and you've got that smooth. Now, if you were to be able to feel this, it feels pretty smooth. But we still have moon craters on here. We still have to work this part. And that's, I guess, one of the keys is knowing just how much to sand. In fact, here's another little spot. See the little moon craters? We know we can take more material off there. But to get the whole thing that looks about like this area here, where there's just little specks of silver around, then you know you've really got a good substrate. When you have that it looks perfectly smooth and you don't see any moon craters and you can feel it, you know you're on the way to having a really nice and a really light finish. Now the only choice I'm going to have here, so I got a little spot up here that I've sanded out, but I don't want to go through into the carbon. What I'm going to do, because it's snowing out there, I'm going to have to set the compressor up out in the garage because I want to get a quick coat of silver on this. Now from this point on, I think we have enough filler talc on there. I'm going to try this and see what a coat of silver is going to look like on this. But that's about as much as of the talc that I'd like to leave on. Not a whole lot more than that. And we'll see what this looks like when we get back in the house. An important thing when you sand it with 600, you see how you can candle it. Let me see how that light walks across the part. Now you can see if you have a flaw, it would show up right now. If you had a little divot, and of course you could fill it with the red putty or just sand it some more. See how you can see the reflection in that part right there? The 1200 is even better at finding those little flaws, but that's why you use silver instead of blue or green or whatever. The silver just shows every little mistake. Now I would guess, just from looking at how this part finished up, I would take a wild guess that when this dries, we'll do the same thing with 1200 paper, and probably be done. Now one of the things, remember how I mentioned before how when you ever take apart plane you kind of make up time later on in the building. Well, with carbon parts you lose time in the beginning making a mold and whatever, but then at this point in time you're not filling any wood grain. There's really nothing to fill here, and it really does impart a relatively nice finish. Real happy with this finish. So my guess is we're one coat away, but with wood parts it can be more. But again, it's not a race. The idea is to get it right, not to get it done quickly. The winner is the one who finishes last with a concourse winning model. Trick, as always, in this cold weather, get everything up by the heating vent and crank the heat up. Now it's a pain painting in this cold, damp weather like this, but you certainly can do it. Just that I wish we lived in sunny Utah or something here. But you can work around it, and the trick is, if you know it's going to be humid like this, put 10-15% retarder in the paint before you even start. Don't even bother doing that first test because it'll fog up. And now I'll see with that first part, if that dries in a half an hour, it'll take me a half an hour to sand the rest of the parts. Before I do the big part, I can always add a little bit more retarder. Hey, it looks like it may even be stopping snowing. I lied, it's still snowing. It's always snow. It's going to snow the day we go to Texas. Unbelievable. You remember when I did the Spitfire, the Brodak Dope videos, we were painting in the snow, but just isn't that much fun. See now, without even sanding, I can see some of these little flaws that the silver is showing me, so as I sand around these, I'll make sure I block sand them. You can see we have some flaws here we need to fix. This is what's beautiful about the silver. I've never found a better way of doing it than just sanding out these coats of silver. Here's some spots down at the back. This really shows you every mistake. Now, because this is a wood part, we don't want the M600 soaking in unnecessarily. So I'm going to do one little spot, clean it, one little spot, and clean it. Now, in a pinch, we could always use Windex or soapy water on our carbon parts, but we can't use it. It's really not practical to use it on wooden parts. Just it's too high risk that we're going to get wood swelling and different things like that. And we know there's a flaw here, so let's work that area real carefully. Now, if you were building a one-piece plane and you were putting it all together at once and sanding it all at once, I just think that would be such a pain, sanding all of these things at once. So now we've picked up a high spot here, a high spot here. So we want to go very carefully here as we're sanding this out. We know we got a high spot, and if we go through, we can always hit it with a little bit of Brodak primer or a little tissue repair, one or the other. And a nice thing about doing this is you're never in big trouble. You can always, you put too much paint on, you can sand it off. You don't have enough, you can put more on. You're never at a point where you have to live with anything other than perfection, or whatever level of finishing you choose. And once you learn these skills, you just use them forever. It may look like a sloppy, messy job, but when you know you can do this kind of finishing, boy, it gives you a lot of choices in modeling. Anyway, we'll do the rest of this, being careful not to get anything inside here, and then get our next coat of silver on this. As we finish up this part, it's never too soon to two things: to get in all the edges and corners, which is one of the things you don't want to have a big paint build up there. And these little tools are so handy. It's never too soon to detail out all the little edges and corners and things like that. Now, another thing I always try to do, keep this wet, every time you sand a part, I say this so many times, break the edge. Just break it. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with a razor blade edge, and as soon as you go to buff it or whatever, that paint starts to chip and peel away because it's on a razor blade edge. If every time you sand out a part, you dress off all the edges, really gives you a heads up. Good head start on having this, that you're not going to have the paint peel up. Now I'm looking around, there's one little spot here I'm not happy with. And this is the whole idea of is just pick away at it. Pick away at it. Don't settle for second best. I know the first time I ever, and I wouldn't even remember which plane it was, but I had gone through step by step by step, basically paid the price, brought the plane to the Nats, came back from wherever they had the pilots meeting and saw that the plane was in the front row. What a rush. What a really good feeling that all your work is worthwhile. And then, of course, being voted concourse winner is a whole nother apple. Something to strive for, something to work for. And even if there were no concourse award or no appearance points like there are in F2B, I could never figure a reason not to have the best looking model I can make. Now, this is pretty much ready to paint. Well, I'm looking forward to going out in that garage. If anything, it feels like it's getting colder out there, not warmer. We got some retarder in the silver, so it should take a little extra to dry. In fact, we may just let it dry overnight instead of trying to get 2 coats in one day. And it seems like the heat has been on most of the time, so those parts should be cooking up nice. You don't want the parts so close to a heating vent that they get little bubbles in them. If they're 3 feet away from a heating vent, 2 feet away, that seems to be fine. Now see, there's one spot right here. Can you see that little shiny spot? Now I know that's going to come out. So there's no point before we even paint it. Let's see if we can get rid of that. That little area there is going to come out. Well, this may all seem like overkill, but no, it's not really. And it depends how bad you want to have a front row or a concourse winner, because usually if you really want one and you don't have one, what it means is you don't want it bad enough. If you want it bad enough, you'll pay this price and you'll eventually get it, that's for sure. I expect one of the next people that's going to really pay the price and put one right in the front row is Kent Tyser. It was good to see Bob Gieske put his plane in the front row. That was, I'm sure, something he enjoyed a lot of. It's a special feeling to have that front row. Now this piece, because it's wood, you see these little spots here? This is where it's dry. It doesn't have enough paint, enough material. It's dry. They're usually glue seams. There's a dry glue seam there. The answer to this is, let it dry, spray a coat of clear on it, and another coat of silver, and then sand it again. Because if we were to sand this now, we're already going to sand right into that spot. There's no point just sanding it over again. Put a coat of clear, let it dry another hour, hour and a half, or whatever, and put another coat of silver. Now you've got enough material that you should be able to get rid of some of those spots. Wood parts generally take just a little more finishing. I'd say probably 30% more finishing time, because you're always fighting the wood grain and the wood moving. Now the fuselage pieces are going to require a little more work. You can see the joints in the tissue. Well, they're going to disappear. We know they're not going to be there. You can see the joints. When we're done sanding this out, you're not even going to see this. But I can tell right away. You see how rough this is? Let's look at it real close. It seems like maybe I put a little more filler on this. The talc is just made it very rough. But doesn't mean anything. We're going to sand this out. First thing is, do a little test. I think 600 might be too smooth for this. Maybe we'll go to 500. Grind this all down. Wherever we have a spot like this, we're going to have to grind it even extra. Now, in this case, well, let's see what we got right here. A lot of times it's easier just to do a part than show it. Usually where you'll have a seam in the tissue, you've got to work that seam. And you can even go to 400 here, probably if you want to make time up, but now you can see the high spot. Now, 2 ways to get rid of these, ultimately. Just put a couple more coats of filler over it. This really only has 1 coat of filler. Or, if you really like using Brodak primer, airbrush in a little bit of primer right over these joints, sand them, they'll go right away. Now, I'm basically going to take the whole section here. I can usually feel where it's going to be. Okay, yeah. And then, well, we'll probably need some primer spots. We're going to have some seams that have to be worked out. Here's where I have the double tissue. Doesn't matter. As long as you keep sanding it, you'll definitely get to the point where this is smooth. And if it isn't, shoot another coat of filler, sand it, shoot another. When you have the double tip, maybe you have to put 2 or 3 extra coats on. Doesn't matter. Material sands so easily that it's really not a big deal. One of the things, now that I have this done, let me clean it. There's a couple of spots on here where I want to get some Brodak primer, where there's just some deep gaps, little imperfections, and the primer fills it a lot quicker than the silver. So I figure as long as I'm going to do the primer, I'll peck around it and I'm going to look at it real carefully and figure out where this would need some primer now. Again, you've got to look at it, and here's the first choice, is I don't think I need to just take and prime the whole thing. It's just going to make a lot of sanding. I'm going to be sanding here for a whole nother day. And although I don't mind doing the sanding, I don't want to waste it. I don't want to just sand something just for the fun of sanding it. Let me show the little spots that I think are going to need primer on this. I'll prime them, let it dry, and then shoot a coat of silver on the whole thing. And I hope that's going to give us the basic base, and maybe we'll only be 1 coat of silver away from having this part finished in the next couple of days, because I'm itching to get started on the rudder. Now what I wanted to do is, if I get to a point where everything is drying, and I have it up by the heating vent, and I want to let it dry for an extra day, I'm assuming it'll take me 1 day, I'll make up the rudder. And that's going to be a nice part of this, because unlike some semi-scale planes where you have to fudge the rudder, we're just going to make a totally scale rudder. We have a scale drawing, we're going to cut the rudder off the drawing, and that's it. When I say selective, you can see there's a little spots like this, a little bit of primer in there. I'm going to look around, probably up around the cockpit. Wouldn't be a bad idea to prime the whole cockpit. Anyway, there's double tissue, I can prime this. It'll just give me a little bit of an edge to sand off. And what I'll do, I'll sand that primer before I put on the silver. There's a little spot up here I can address. There's actually a little gouge in the tissue there, and in the back, and all along these edges. And that's what Brodak primer is good for. I think where it works the best is when you finish selectively. A little spot up here maybe. Best to run your hand on things. If you feel a little spot you're not happy with, Brodak primer is a good choice. I'll wipe this down with M600 again. I didn't really get it thoroughly. And of course the cockpit, because these areas here are going to be that blue tinted glass with Brodak candy apple blue, much like the B-25. And these are really going to jump out at you. If there's even the slightest little flaw in there, you're going to see it. One of the features I really thought worked out well was the candy apple blue to nose section. The way those windows worked out, the glass areas, I think that was a defining part of the model. But those areas had better be perfect. If there's a fingernail mark in them, well, you'll see them right away. Anyway, let me put a coat of primer on this, selective primer, and then we'll get back and sand that coat out. Okay, we got some selected areas primed. Once this is dry to the touch, I always like to let it dry 15-20 minutes and then put it up by the heating vent. You don't want to put it right up by the heating vent. 15 minutes or so, it'll go up by the heating vent with the other parts. I think we're well on our way to having a good substrate on this finish. Now that white primer in the selected spots looks like it dried up pretty nice. What I'm going to do is just lightly sand this. I'm looking for any spots that still need to be addressed. We probably got most of them covered here. There was a spot up here that was a little... This sort of be... If you've never sanded Brodak primer, it's very, very user-friendly to sand, that's for sure. Again, user-friendly is the best word I know of here. Sands easily. You don't want to leave a lot on because it's heavy. So we just want to sand enough of this off that we're back down to whatever our square one was. And that's all we want to leave, is just the little spots. Just little spots. So we'll sand this whole thing down, just leaving those little dots and spots, and the next coat of silver should really lay out nice and flat. This whole piece sanded out. You can see some of the spots that needed some more attention. Basically what we're going to try to do now is shoot on a coat of ordinary silver and see what it lays down like, see if it lays down the way we want it to. Everything, even though you see these joints, you can't feel them, so they should get buried in the paint relatively easily now. But as rough as some of these parts look at this point when they're sanded like this, as soon as you paint them, they really come right to life. And I think this is going to be a very, very nice finish on this once we finish this up. This is really starting to get me excited. I'm not sure how many more coats of silver this is going to need, but it's starting to look nice, but you never know as soon as you start sanding into it. And we'll let that dry up by the heating vent another day. And then take a look at all the parts. If the fuselage needs an extra day to dry, we have some little spots we can touch up on the wing. We're never out of spots to touch up. And of course, if everything's drying, then we can work on that rudder drawing. After drying up by that heating vent for a day or so, it's actually a little more than 24 hours, I want to look around for any spots I want to work on. Got a spot right there, I don't know what that's all about. A couple little spots up here. But what I think I'll do, because I have time to work on this today, I'll give this a whole thorough sanding and just give it another coat of silver, since we're going to have plenty of dry time. With all the snow out there, we have plenty of dry time. Even though this looks like a lot of people might be happy with this, and you know, maybe at one point in my life I would have been happy too. I know I can make this better, but right now it's all 1200, no 600 at all. I don't want to leave a single scratch in this. Make sure we got 1200. And using 1200, of course, it takes a little bit longer to cut through. We'll just show one little spot and then we'll do the rest of it off camera. But you're actually polishing now. You're more polishing than cutting. You're not changing the shape of anything. Because we're really striving for perfection here. We're not striving to get this done by tomorrow night or something. We have no timetable, and that's a good way to work on things. Keep everything soaking wet. 1200 just takes a little bit longer to cut through, but the end result is it really leaves that nice smooth finish. And when we have this, I'm assuming it'll take about an hour to sand this whole thing out, and we get that next coat of silver on, it's really going to be looking nice, I think. Now see, that's about as far as I can go. I'm coming through, and that's about as far as I want to go. I'm coming through to where the primer was on that part, cutting through to where that high edge is. If I get the whole thing done like this and get it ready for another coat of silver, hey, I'm going to be really happy today. That's one of the things now is when you get to this point, you have to close it out. You can't just say, well, that's good enough. I always say, well, that's the last coat of silver. 2 days later, I look at it, and I want to put another coat on. I just get fussier and fussier. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if it's my own, well, I don't know, but it's the way I like to build. And I get a lot of satisfaction out of knowing when this part is done, it's going to be as good as I possibly can make it. Yeah, that really, I mean, I don't know if you can see, there's actually a little shine on that. You can see all the spots where we went through the silver, the primer, all of that stuff, all of the touch-up. And let's hope we're ready for, every time we do it, we say the last coat of silver. Let's say one of the last coats of silver. Well, it looks like we got a decent day to spray some of this silver anyway. Still a lot of snow around. Hoping I can get this sprayed, get it in the garage for the day, because it'll dry real slow out there. I'm really hoping, because it's cold and it'll dry outside, maybe this coat will lay down real nice. We're going to find out in a minute. Boy, the wind is, oh, wind is blowing. As the fuselage blows away. Whoa. Whoa, I better get a better grip on this. I'm spraying with a really low pressure. I just want to put on a very thin coat, because if I do have any flaws come through here, I want to address them right now. Hopefully not have to put too many more coats on. And once I get this dust coat on, then we're just going to... See, the whole purpose of this is just to see if there are any flaws in this paint. Let's see if we can find some that would look pretty obvious. We're going to have to get it on before we can go any further. And what I'll do, I'll just up the pressure. And right on top of this dust coat, put a wet coat. And so far, everything up there looks fine. But the thing is, once you do this, you always find something that you're not happy with. I do anyway. I think almost everything is dusted now. You notice when you dust on a coat too, it doesn't lay down. It's like it dries like 600 grit sandpaper. Now the good news is I haven't seen one spot on there that looks like it's going to need major body work or anything. So what I'm going to do, let this tack up a little bit and just up the pressure now to the normal amount and put a wet coat on. Now notice the difference with this is about 25 to 30 pounds of pressure. This coat is going to go on wet. And because it's cold, this should lay right down. Of course, you get a lot more coverage, but that's about what it's going to be like in this temperature anyway. So I'll get this wetted out. But that wind is murder. Good thing I'm not doing the wing or the nacelles. That part of it would be murder to doing this. It's going to lay down very nice. I often think of how would you paint this plane if it was in one piece. It's hard enough painting it when it's like this. Now, because we're in the sun, I can rotate it around, look for any spots that look a little dry. There's one. Right there, I got that spot. Take it out in the sun. Now this is not the silver that's going to get back to. This is not the silver that's going to be on the plane. The B25 silver is going to be the final coat, but for a base coat, that's looking pretty good right now. Now the trick is to get this outside drying in a cold garage. And by tomorrow, this should have laid down real nice, give me a nice base. Now, with it drying out here with the thermometer about 40 degrees, this will definitely take, actually it'll take overnight to dry, but it'll lay out a lot nicer than if we put it up by the heating vent. Now with the A26, we have one of the rare luxuries of being able to use the stock rudder. What we did, in fact, is when Les enlarged the scale plan, we left it exactly scale, and the only things we've modified are moving the nacelles forward and the canopy forward this amount, and it's proportionally. So what it is we're really still in proportion. Now, I had thought of one of the things I would have liked to do is maybe, for some reason, change the shape of the rudder, either make it a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. And then the more I thought about it, I said, hell, I'm just going to put a scale rudder on it. It is relatively large relative to the size of the plane. Now, and when a rudder on a stunt ship gets too big, the plane can tend to weather vane, like the Red Baron is a good example of that. The rudder was just too much side area behind the CG. But then when you think of the compromise, and the more I think about this, the more I don't want to make any compromises at all. I just want it to be, well, we have the scale drawing. I'm going to have to lay it out. We're not going to have a movable rudder. I'm going to make this all one piece and try to make this little fairing in the back. This, of course, swoops right up to where the window is. So having the plan is going to make this a lot easier by far. In fact, I look at it from a lot of different angles. The idea that it's so big is really one of the defining features of the model. When you look at it right away, you say, whoa, the tail is too big for the model. Well, but in this case, we're kind of married to it. And just like on the B-25, we're going to have to live with the fact that probably it's going to have a little more side area than we originally wanted. And I had thought at one time, Les and I thought about putting a Raby rudder. I says, nah, not gonna even bother. The planes this big usually don't need anything to help them hold line tension. In this picture here, you can see how big that is. It's really one of the defining features. It's one of the features that makes the model so attractive. Is it's got that real definitive rudder. You can't mistake that rudder for any other plane that I know. And I guess you could compromise any model, even if you made a scale P51 and just put the rudder right off the side view. But again, I go back and forth and think about all that side area and think about downsizing it and this and that, and I come up with all these little things that may or may not be a little bit better performance-wise, and I think, but what I'm really looking for is the scale look here. So I'm just going to have to pay the price. I guess that's the bottom line. And you can see some of the later models had a broader rudder. They've added some rudder area. But that rudder is truly one of the defining features. One of the things that I think in its own way makes this model something that I'd enjoy modeling. It just gives it a look. And it's really like no other rudder. It's really got a unique shape. I always think too, how is that rudder shape going to look like in a square loop or in a triangle or whatever? Something that really isn't totally important, but yet I think that is going to accent maneuvers real nice. I'm just going to get less of scale playing out and start laying out some parts for what I hope is going to be the lightest, most scale looking rudder I can make here. The first thing I want to do on this project, this is the drawing we have, and this is the full size, full scale 826 rudder. What I want to do, I want to make a tracing of this on some tracing paper, so I have that exact shape in my hand, and then I can start laying out how I want to build it. And as crude of a drawing as this is, I think we've managed to make a pretty good replica of a model from just these basic drawings. Just made a rough tracing on ordinary Mylar. Now I want to pull this off of the drawing so I can work on this as a separate entity and lay out what some of the construction things will be. Okay, this was just a rough sketch I made, subject to change as we go along. I want to cut this piece out, so I'll just take this piece out and trace it. That's going to be a piece of soft 3/8 because there's going to be a lot of curvature in there. And then I'll figure out how I want to lay out the ribs. And so now I want to get the grain going in this direction. So the first part of this piece, we'll lay out on a piece of this wood. Lay it out on the other end, looks a little straighter. Now we need to figure out where I can make this joint here. I don't want to have this end grain sticking straight up. I want to have a notch here. So what I'll do is, let's see how I can figure this out. I can cut this whole piece out to start with. And again, these pieces just need to be roughed out. But I want the grain going straight up and down here. That's the primary thing. Okay, now we can take this piece over to the jigsaw. We'll take a break from our from our rudder frame out here to look at. There's a picture Scott Dinger sent of his latest mufflers. We already have two of these in use, and obviously it looks like he's anodizing some custom colors. So anyway, contact Scott Dinger. He's in Pampa, and his name of his business is High Flow Mufflers, and very soon we'll have his web email address. He's making a website as we speak. And he'll be making up the soon-to-be the headers for the A26. Our buddy Scott Dinger. And boy, we had a great time at last year's Nats. I hope he'll be there again this year. These mufflers look pretty cool. Now we want to lay out this piece here. I want the grain going in this direction. And I want it to go further up the piece. So I'm trying to decide, do I want to make it, let's see. Let's look at this. We can do this the other way. Let's put this here, The objective here is I don't want to have the grain. Let's see, we could cut this piece. Probably back about here would be okay. Okay, so let's just look. I could take some of this off. This would be okay, because I don't want to have the grain. I want this grain going straight up and down, but I don't want to be catching a lot of end grain in there. So let's just slot this back. And then we can lay out the other piece. And now we have this piece laid out, we can lay this piece on top of this. And I know this piece now is the piece I need to cut off. Okay, now we got this glued, we got the grain directions we want it in for this leading edge piece. The next thing I want to do is get a center line down the whole part. Actually going to be the line that we're going to try to carve to. I need to figure out the shape of one rib here. I have 9 ribs to make. Figure out the shape of one since it's going to taper to the back. And then we'll cut. I want 9 altogether. You can set the stripper to this thickness since we know this is going to be the thickest part at the front, and it's going to have a taper toward the back. And just set the stripper to this dimension. Leave them a little on the plus side so we can sand them. And just strip off some 16th inch rib blanks. I just made a rough pattern. They're going to taper to a piece of 1/8 inch in the back. So now what I did, this is the smallest these will ever be. So by having that one up there, there we go, as these are going to taper back, the back where the taper is from here back is going to taper, but the front piece will be relatively flat until I put that little bit of a curve in it. So I'm going to start out with all the ribs being this shape in the back and straight up in the front. Now the reason for that is real easy. It'll make building it almost warp free. We'll be able to lay this on a flat table, jig up the ribs, and put this all together with pretty good accuracy. That's what hopefully is going to happen. We'll see when we're done. Then we're going to do a little bit of tapering in the front, and then of course sheet it with 16th sheet, or maybe some 50,000 sheet if we can find some real good stuff. So the next thing is to measure each rib. In each case, each one is going to get bigger. Measure each rib, and then transpose this taper into the back end of every one. So we know this being rib 2 is going to end here. We can very easily transpose that. Again, these ribs only have to be the roughest of shapes, because ultimately we're going to block sand everything in to get the final contours. This just makes the block sanding just a little bit easier. And we can go right down the line, and in a matter of a few minutes have all our ribs. And what I can do if I want to is put a pin through all 9 of them and block sand them into shape, define a little bit. Now with 2, you can see how quick these are going to go. We'll get all of these laid out.
But the tide is coming.
I want to make sure I have no big globs of glue or anything on the table here. Just get the glass cleaned. And I basically can lay out my rudder drawing, make sure I don't have any schmutz on the back. Okay, that should work. I found a piece of scrap. This is really sea-grainy. I want to block this piece out in 1/8 inch and then make some little shims that are going to go underneath it. So in essence, this will be held up off the table 1/8 of an inch when we put the ribs in. But sea grain here is really going to hopefully be a big help. Now I'm just going to figure out where I want to pin these little shims. Again, they're just 1/8 inch shims. This, by the way, is an old John DeTavio trick. If you look at the Falcon plans, this was one of the things I thought was pretty good on the Falcon plans. Good way to build it. And it really lets you build a rudder or a tail or an elevator relatively straight. See, this holds this up in place. Since the beginning is 3/8 and this is 1/8, we're right on center. And then we can just drop our ribs in, tack them in place. Now that allows us to just tack ribs in. Now because this part of the rib is flat, it holds this in pretty good alignment. And in fact, once we get these set, we'll tack glue one of these right to the table. Okay, now we have that in place. In fact, no sense making it any more complicated than it has to be. Leave out one step. Now I've got something, the trailing edge will be down relatively solid, hopefully. And just make dropping the ribs in one by one a little bit easier. Line this up here. What are you doing, Chicky? Just take a little bit of an angle on these. And you pretty much can see it's just a matter of time. We just drop them in one right after another. Lucky enough that we can trim some of this without breaking the part. All we want to do is get the edges nice and smooth. That's a good little trick from the old JD Falcon planes. What we want to do is true this up. There ain't glue high spots on it. So what we're going to use, I have some wing skins already joined, the 050 thousandths wing skins, a little thinner than a 16th, which I think may work on this. If it doesn't, it's going to be time to make another rudder. This is one of our 50 thousandths wing skins, and what I'm going to do is just run a little bead on the part that I know is flat. From here to here is flat, and then make sure I have the same amount of clearance on each side. Bring that up, just tack it in position. I'm trying to get the grain to go exactly straight up and down. I don't need that to go any further off than that. That was the whole idea of leaving this flat up in the front, is this part of it is flat, should help make, semi-help make a warp-free fin and rudder here. Now, I know that straight up till and once this kicks, then I'm going to roll this over and do the back edge. Now let's see if this works as I planned. If I hold this down, I've got contact on all the ribs now. Now I just have to wait till this kicks. I don't want to use any kicker. And then I'll get the last little bit in the trailing edge. It looks pretty straight so far. Now I can trim off the extra wood. Now that that's all tacked in, I can run a thin bead down each rib. This should lock it right in position. Now what I can do is trace out the other side of this. Let's see which is the good side of the wing skin. That's not a great spot there. I don't like that. That's not good. Let's trace it down here. And let's get a match on the grain if we can. That seems pretty close. Now I can trace this out. Cut it a little bit oversized. Won't really matter as long as we're a little bit oversized here. And this one I got to put on with pins. So I'm going to put this together with aliphatic. Whoops. Cut that out, put that together with aliphatic and 1,000,000 pins, and then let it sit overnight. Now what we're dependent on here is that we're going to be able to get this side of the glue to complete the box, and this will have to sit overnight. Les has been having real good luck using this. I just realized there's something I forgot to do here. Good thing I'm not using CA. I got to poke a hole in every one of these ribs to relieve the pressure. If you remember, one of the things we don't want to have, hopefully, is, let's just do it. Doesn't have to be cute. One hole in every rib, just to relieve the pressure.
Otherwise, when the surfaces go out in the sun, there's nowhere for the air to get out, and I'll have to drill a little hole under the rudder here. They tend to get puffy. So if this sits overnight, tomorrow we'll be able to carve and sand some of it. Somewhat, anyway. Now, because when this glue evaporates, it's water soluble, what typically happens is it weighs almost nothing. Not much of it stays in the model. So I'm not going to try to be cheap with glue. Rather than cheap, what I'm going to try to do is get a good imprint in here now. So you can see that left a pretty decent imprint. We got one spot up here where I'm not happy with it.